All right, in this lesson, we want to discuss the topic of household codes that exist in the New Testament. The household codes probably relate more to the family than specifically to the church. So you might ask, does this have a place in a class on church and gender? I think it probably does, just because of how significant these codes are in the New Testament. They're pretty common. There's more material, like by verse count, in what I'm calling, or what has been called, the household codes than any of the other passages about gender that we're discussing. So it's hard to ignore them. They're very sizable, even though they don't specifically talk about church interaction. If you want to look at the household codes, it's a genre of literature that we find in the New Testament and in ancient other documents. There's a handful of them. Colossians 3:18 through 4:1. It's basically any passage that talks about husbands do this, wives do this, children do this, parents do that, masters do this, servants do that. Ephesians 5:21 through 6, verse 9. 1 Timothy 6:1 and 2 just has one for servants, doesn't include the others. Titus 2:1 through 10 seems like it's kind of like a household code, but it also emphasizes generational commands of older folks do this, younger folks do that, as again part of the structure and order of social life. And then 1 Peter 2:18 through chapter 3, verse 7 talks about husbands and wives specifically at some length, and husbands and masters, and how to be good citizens, and just how to run a household, and that's what they're called. So it's quite a lot of material in the New Testament when you think about it. What are some common features of the household codes? One feature in the New Testament household codes, not other literature, is that all are to be mutually subject to each other. It's one of the points of emphasis in the New Testament. Whenever it talks about these codes, it says everyone has a place to be submissive. Everyone has a place to be subject. And so it's different than other types of household codes that tend to really stress hierarchy. Depending on your point of view, there may still be hierarchy present in the New Testament codes, but they also stress heavily the fact that even the people at the top of what might be perceived as a hierarchy have a responsibility morally to the people at the bottom of the hierarchy. And so there's a different kind of submission involved that might be absent in other types of codes. In these, typically, the wife is subject to her husband or submits to her husband. The word submit comes, I believe, from the Greek hupostasso. Stapo is stand, and hupo is under. So it's stand under. There's some kind of arrangement, some kind of hierarchy or system at work, and I'm standing underneath it, and that's the meaning of submit. The wife is submissive to her husband, but the husband is commanded to love and to honor his wife, which isn't always present in the household codes of the ancient world, but it's stressed in the New Testament. Children are to obey parents, and parents are told not to provoke evil in their children, that they have a moral responsibility. Slaves are to honor and obey master. The word slave is doulos in the Greek, and there's always some debate about whether that means slave or servant or something in between, like bond servant. But regardless, there's a relationship there. Masters are to treat their slaves justly and fairly, and that was an obligation. From a complementarian perspective, when you read these codes in the New Testament, you would say these are given by the Holy Spirit to the church for all of time. It's right there in your Bible. They represent God's will for the family and for society at large. God doesn't just have a will for the church. He also has a will for other spheres. And so quite often folks will say, there's the sphere of civil government, there's the sphere of the family, and the sphere of the church. And they'll put those kind of three categories and say God has a system in place for all of those. Some will say, they may say less strongly. They may say that some of this is an accommodation to the ancient world, but the basic principle is good. So, for example, we struggle with the master-servant one. If that's master-slave, none of us own slaves, I'm hoping. And so we would kind of confine that to the ancient world and say, no, we don't want any part of that. So some will say some of it may be permanent, some of it temporary, or maybe the master-slave relationship fits neatly onto the employee-employer relationship in a capitalist system. Maybe that's the point. I don't know, maybe, but that's the basic discussion from a complementarian point of view. Egalitarian is going to say these codes reflect first century values. They are attempts to help Christians live in Roman society, to be in the world but not of it. But they do not affirm all the values of Roman society. So in other words, one of the complaints from Romans about Christians was that they were subverting Roman society. You guys are just going to ruin what it means to be Roman. And so maybe Paul is giving these household codes with the intent of, here's how a Christian can live in that society. No, we don't affirm everything Romans believe about the home, about the government, certainly about the church. But you can follow this version of those rules as kind of an accommodation to the society you live in. So the egalitarian would say, today, Christian household codes in modern society would reflect modern society. And so in our world, where you have greater gender equality in, say, in the workplace and in government, the household would also reflect that, and you wouldn't have some of this hierarchical terminology that exists. That was just an accommodation to its time in history. That's one egalitarian point of view. There's others. Probably one of the more notable passages that I want to spend some time on as an example of this is in the book of Ephesians. Ephesians, the best I can say to explain Ephesians is that it's one of those, what are they called, Nastroika dolls? I may be saying that wrong. The Russian dolls, where they're nesting dolls, where you have one inside the other, inside the other, inside the other. And that's kind of the structure of Ephesians. So Ephesians has two big chunks, Ephesians 1 through 3, and then 4 through 6. There's the kind of theological opening, and then the practical end of chapters 4 through 6. In chapters 4 through 6, it emphasizes personal behavior, and that culminates in verses like 17 and following, which give a statement about being filled with the Spirit, and then open up that doll. Being filled with the Spirit is explained through a series of participial phrases. Open up that doll. The last of those participle phrases is explained with a household code. So it just the structure just keeps getting more finely tuned as you move to the end of the book. But here's verses 17 and following. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is, and do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another, that's our hypostaso word, our stand under arrangement, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So I put in blue here the main terms. Be filled is our main verb that's guiding this lengthy kind of run-on sentence that just keeps on going. How can you be filled with the Spirit? What is involved in a Spirit-filled life? Usually, being filled with the Spirit is a promise in the New Testament. Here it's stated as a command, right? Well, I'm supposed to do that. What does that mean? Well, he gives you some phrases, all these ing verbs. Go back to grade school, sorry. The participles are the ing words, and they are modifying the main verb. And so it kind of looks like this. Be filled with the Spirit. How do you do that? Addressing one another, singing, making melody, giving thanks, submitting. And then at the end of that, the very last one was by submitting one to another. Okay, Paul, how do I submit one to another? Seems like I'm supposed to submit to one person who would be above me. How do I have mutual submission? And that's where Paul gives us these household codes in the following verses. The structure of the household code in Ephesians breaks up into three parts. There's one section, the longest, is about husbands and wives, and then a shorter section in chapter 6 on parents and children, and then a little bit medium-sized passage at the end of middle of chapter 6 about masters and servants. Our interest, because we're interested in gender in this class, is on the husband and wife discussion. Let's read that. Verses 22 through 24. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. What can we notice here that we can probably all agree on? Women are addressed directly in verses 22 to 24 rather than through their husbands. In most of the household codes that we read, and even a lot of the text of the Old Testament, when something is said about how a house is run, it may talk about the wives, but it doesn't say wives do this, it says, husbands, tell your wives to do this. Okay. That's not how Ephesians is worded, and that's not how we see that in the New Testament. Instead, Paul speaks directly to women, right? Acknowledging that I'm not telling your husband to get you in line. I'm telling you, you have human dignity and worth, and I'm telling you how to behave in this situation. Wives are specifically told to submit to their husbands. What that means then is kind of the debate, because we have to recall that everyone in this context is being told to submit in some way, right? That it starts out with submit one to another, everyone submit one to another, and then it lists means of submission. So before we're done, everybody's going to get some way to submit. So the question is, what is the meaning of the submission handed to the wives specifically, and how does that relate to their husbands? And then also the husbands are said to be the head of the wife, which we've already seen come up a couple of times in this study, and it's kind of an interesting idea. Complementarian perspective. This reflects the headship established in Adam in creation. Head is an unavoidably hierarchical term. The head's on the top, and here's my body. And the head, at least in modern thought, seems to be where the brain is, and that controls the body and makes determinations for the body. So men are to be moral and spiritual leaders of the family, is the created order that the complementarian sees present in this text. From an egalitarian perspective, the sense of head employed here is more like headwaters or fountainhead. Head means source, not leader. The ancient person may not have thought of the head as the source of all the choices for the body. The ancient person didn't understand what a brain was, to be perfectly honest with you. There's ancient texts that argue about, wonder what all that gray stuff is up here in people's heads when they would cut open dead bodies and try to do medical experiments. They said, well, I don't really know what that's for. It was much later they figured out, that kind of controls the whole body. But at that time, that wasn't the way people thought of it. When you think about choices, you think about the heart is a word the New Testament uses a lot, or the guts, like your emotions come from down lower in your guts and your bowels. This great phrase we'll find in the New Testament, bowels of compassion. If your intestines care at all, well, that sounds weird in English, but that's the idea, that they were thinking that a person's substance comes from other places in the body. So when you said head, they didn't necessarily think, the brain controls and is in charge, like we would. And so the egalitarian person is going to notice that and say, so maybe it means something else, like source. This is maybe a bad example, but if you look at a little tiny baby, they got big giant heads and little bodies. We kind of seem to grow out of our heads, if you think about it. So they might have thought of it that way, that in the same way a river has headwaters and a fountain has a head where the spring comes out. Maybe, the husband is the life-giving source of the family, and maybe that's what was meant by it. That's more in line with one of the egalitarian perspectives you would see. Our text in Ephesians goes on, verses 25 through 30. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the body, because we are members of his body. So again, what can we observe that we can probably all agree on? Number one, husbands are warned at length. If you just compare the verse count, who gets the longer scolding? Who gets more verse count? It's the husbands. Women come first, which is fascinating. Wouldn't you expect? Men, we'll start with you. No, we're going to start speaking directly to wives, and it's fairly brief. Submit to your husbands, as unto the Lord. The husbands are second and given a much lengthier description of their responsibilities. They are given sacrificial, selfless description. That the way that they submit is by not thinking about what they want in a relationship to their wives, but rather in submitting their own will to the best interest of the wife. So that's a different kind of submission, but still submission at work in this relationship. Mistreatment of the wife is compared to self-harm. It's like beating yourself up. No one would harm his own body. And so again, it's a really strong passage, really angled at men. So it's strange to me that when we read Ephesians 5, we always get hung up on the 3 verses about wives and whether they submit. And we miss that the much longer, bigger, heavier-handed point is husbands and the way that they need to submit in that relationship by putting their will second to another person's well-being. And then verses 31 through 33 close out the chapter with an interesting statement that's variously interpreted. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. I'm going to disagree with the English Standard Translation here. I'm actually going to disagree with nearly every translating committee on this one. I wrote a paper on this a couple years ago, and I'm fairly 90-some-odd% convinced that that last sentence has been mistranslated in a really obvious way. The way it reads now in the ESV, let each one of you love his wife as himself, let the wife see that she respects her husband. It sounds like a conclusion that gives an instruction in 2 directions. Here's our sum, women do this, men do this. That's not how I believe it's structured in the Greek text. I think the way it should be translated is, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself in order that the wife may respect her husband. I do think Ephesians 5 is actually more about husbands than wives. And the conclusion isn't, now you do this and you do that. The conclusion is, husbands, if you want to be respected, you have to earn that respect through the way in which you treat your wife. That to me is consistent with the overall message of the end of chapter 5 in a way that kind of a summary statement isn't. I wouldn't be real contentious about it. I don't think it actually shifts our overall point today one way or the other, but just as a message to husbands, because I'm a preacher, I get to preach a little bit. Husbands, this is the way you should read this verse. Respect isn't something that you get to demand. I tried that. This is one of my most embarrassing stories about myself, but as a young whippersnapper preacher and a young husband, I thought I could get my house in order by telling my wife, to her face, you will respect me as Christ is respected by the church. That conversation ended poorly, as you might guess, not because my wife didn't respect me, it turns out she does, but because that's not how respect works. You can't order someone to respect you. If you have to tell someone, respect me, you've already lost their respect somehow. And the better interpretation of this is, husbands, if you want to be respected like the church submits to Christ, you're going to have to act like Christ. And that's the message here. Another household code of some interest is 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7. Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives, when they see your respectful and pure conduct. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry, the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. All right, what's going on in that one? A couple of observations that we can make, again, that shouldn't be really controversial. Whereas Ephesians, the lengthier portion of the text, warns husbands, in 1 Peter, the bigger chunk of the text warns wives, and there's only a verse or two about husbands. So it's kind of a reversal of emphasis. So I'm going to say Ephesians emphasizes husbands straighten up, and 1 Peter says wives straighten up. Okay, both of them have something to say to both of us. Sarah is used as an example here, which, again, good reminder, if you want to be treated like Sarah treated Abraham, maybe you got to act like Abraham, fellas. which kind of seems to be the point there at the end. The husbands are strongly warned about abusive behavior, that if you do not treat her in a particular way, we need to discuss what that is, your prayers are hindered. God is not listening to men who do not treat their wives as they ought to. Abuse is not a question of gray area when it comes to New Testament morality. What are the questions that come out of that passage that are going to cause us some consternation? One question that comes out is, what does it mean by saying the wife is the weaker vessel? Best I could tell you, it doesn't say she is the weaker vessel. It says show her honor as the weaker vessel. So it's possible that what Peter is saying is not women are weak. That could be the point. I don't think it has to be the point. So let me start with kind of a literal interpretation, which would say women are the weaker vessel. Well, he could have in mind just a biological fact. Male muscle mass, on average, is greater than female muscle mass. In this, I think being a gentleman doesn't have to be a bad thing. I don't think it's misogyny to be protective of women. Some women feel that way. I disagree. I think being protective of women is something reasonable because, on average, men have more mass and physical power, and so because of that, we have to use it responsibly. That might be what Peter has in mind. Or, when he says honor her as the weaker vessel, it means treat her as if she is a more weaker vessel. And take this vessel there kind of literally. In your kitchen, you have different kinds of dishes. I've got some Tupperware, and it's pretty near indestructible. And when I use it, I just fling it around the kitchen, and I don't care. I toss it in the sink to be clean. I throw it in the dishwasher. We also have some nice dishes. We have some items that we were given when we got married years ago that we've kept care of, and they're more easily broken, and as a result, have greater value to me. So the message here might be not that she is weaker, but treat her as the weaker vessel. Treat your wife as fine china, not like Tupperware. That might be the message. And it's not a statement of whether she's strong or smart or anything like that, but how men ought to treat women may be the implication there. Otherwise, I think you can discuss that and get some ideas out of it. The big key is if you're not treating her in an understanding way, understanding of her, your prayers are hindered in their passage to God.